Alright guys, this is part 2 of chapter 2, and we're going to look at the settling of some of the other colonies. We're going to start off here with Maryland. You can see Maryland is located just north of Virginia and just south of Pennsylvania there. Now, Maryland is going to be the first proprietary colony, which basically means it was chartered to a person, sort of like a monopoly over the colony, if you want to think about it that way. So the king granted it to this guy, Lord Baltimore, Lord Calvert would be his name, and he wanted to settle it as a refuge for English Catholics because he had converted to Catholicism. He won't actually do it. It'll be his son, Cecilius Calvert, that actually is going to be the guy to settle the colony, and it'll be a refuge for Catholics. What's going to happen, though, is that since it's a proprietorship, the owner of the colony, which will be Lord Baltimore, will sort of be like the chief of it, and he's going to be allowed to make laws based on the consent of the freedmen living in the area, and the freedmen are going to be landowners. So, when he gets their consent, he can pass laws. This leads to the establishing of a sort of state legislature, which over time ends up splitting into two houses. You have the sort of Catholic Governor's Council, and then the Protestant freedmen immigrants from Virginia who had moved in, and they basically set up this sort of bicameral legislature. The interesting thing is that Maryland will be a little bit more profitable than Virginia because it will have a better climate for growing tobacco and more coastal waterways to then ship that tobacco. So to the north of Maryland and Virginia, we had the New England colonies. Now the New England colonies are going to be different, and you'll see as we go through this that you'll have the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. And all three will share certain things, yet be different, more likely, on a lot of other stuff. So settling in New England, most of the families would have been middle-class families. Remember I was talking about in class about how there had been this rise in wages and all that sort of stuff in urban areas due to the enclosure movement and all that sort of stuff. Well, now now there were going to be more poor people because you didn't have feudalism or whatever, but now you had an emerging middle class. A lot of the Puritans and people that settled in New England would have been middle-class families that could have paid their way across. So they wouldn't have been like indentured servants or slaves or even looked to be, agriculturalists, because the geography of New England was drastically different than other places south of it. There's not a lot of fields, that kind of thing. So what that meant was there never grew to be this large planter elite, right, which we see as being a driving force in the middle and southern colonies. These guys that own large plantations or ranches or farms or whatever you want to think of it, that make lots and lots of money, that can push legislation and stuff like that for their own benefit. In New England, it's going to be different. You're going to have fishermen, you're going to have like entrepreneurs. It's going to be a little bit more urban in certain places, like say Boston, but it'll have a distinct sort of culture all its own. One of the major benefits to settling in New England versus, say, settling in the South was you had a much longer life expectancy because it was a much healthier place to live. The climate was cool, so it kept down on, disease-causing insects and all that sort of stuff. As it says in your textbook, life expectancy was much longer during the 17th century. Only 21,000 colonists arrived in New England compared to the 120,000 who went into the Chesapeake Bay. But by 1700, New England's white populations exceeded that of Maryland and Virginia. Also, as it says in Jamestown, colonists who arrived in America seeking adventure and profit, most early New Englanders were motivated by religion. And that's going to be the big idea. Your textbook's going to talk about how they self-describe saints and all that sort of stuff. Realize that Puritans are going to be sort of persecuted back in Europe to some extent, and are now looking for their own place to settle and carve out their own niche. So as I mentioned earlier, the Puritans were sort of religious, not fundamentalists, but they were definitely more fundamental than previous European groups, all right? And so they wanted to leave the Church of England. They saw it as too Catholic. They saw it, your textbook will sort of go through all the reasons why they saw it as too Catholic. But what you need to understand is they didn't like the way the priest dressed and the music, and they saw it all as sort of a little bit too much. And so what happens is James the First, who you might know from his version of the Bible and from earlier talk about the English Revolution or Civil War or whatever, he makes it his mission to rid England of these Puritan separatists, is what they'll be called, or nonconformists. And so he draw and quarters 3 of them, and he says he's going to like kill them or run them off or whatever. So they decide to leave. And their first spot isn't really to leave and go to the New World, it's to go to Holland. And so they flee to Holland, and they live in Holland for several years, and they come to the conclusion that even though they like Holland, they don't like the fact that their children are going to grow up not really having an English upbringing. And so they decide that they need to go somewhere else, and the New World offers them that opportunity. And so what they do is they make a deal with the London Company, to sail to Virginia and start a colony. So they set forth Virginia in 1620, and they board the Mayflower. There's, I think, roughly 100 of them. Now, not all of the people aboard were Puritan. There were a handful of them that were actually, as your textbook refers to, as strangers, people who had not received the grace of God yet. And that's going to make for an interesting dynamic. So eventually they run across a storm. This blows them off course. They're worried, they're praying, all that sort of stuff. And when they come and they sight land on December 26th, they realize that they're going to set foot not in Virginia but somewhere else. And so before they set foot, they have to make an agreement. And what they do is they make the Mayflower Compact. And we'll read this in class and talk about it, but this is going to basically bind them to law of a civil body politic, which is important, so that when they get off the boat, they can have some sense of order. Because think about it, all these Puritans with these really hard laws and rules to uphold, they're going to get off the boat, and you're going to have people that aren't really following that because of their religious beliefs or whatever, is going to cause chaos. So they institute these laws and tie themselves to it through the Mayflower Compact. So the church leadership that had created basically the standing in the church and how they were going to run the church was also now going to run basically their civil government as well. So as it says in the notes right here, the civil government evolved out of the church government. Now, as I mentioned earlier with the English Revolution, Civil War idea, this was the same kind of thing that sort of happened in, or what the Roundheads, or whatever you want to call the Protestant sort of Presbyterian guys in England wanted when they were fighting that revolution. They wanted more say about what happened, remember? And they talked about how they elect their own preachers or whatever versus, say, the church that appoints priests. Now, what's going to happen is they're going to show up and they're going to have a tough time of it because they weren't used to this environment. Luckily, a Indian by the name of Squanto finds them. Now, Squanto was a member of the Wampanoag people. Wampanoag, I guess that's how you say it. Basically meant Eastern, and literally translated as people of the dawn, meaning, the sun rises in the east kind of idea. And Squanto had been captured by one of John Smith's lieutenants with the idea of selling him into slavery. So he takes him back to Spain, where he is going to be sold into slavery. Luckily, some Franciscan friars catch wind of this guy's idea, and they eventually free Squanto. And Squanto makes his way all the way back to the eastern seaboard of the United States, to where his village would have been, just to find that his village had been wiped out by disease, smallpox, maybe leprosy. We're not exactly sure what all diseases it was, but everybody had died and moved on. And now these new people, these white European people, had begun to settle there. But Squanto is going to, get over that and help these people learn how to grow food, grow maize and fish, and become self-sustaining. And this is where we get the first ideas of the idea of Thanksgiving from that. The Massachusetts Bay Colony eventually absorbs Plymouth Plymouth being smaller, the Massachusetts Bay Colony ending up being larger. It was also part of the same movement, to some extent, that had settled Plymouth, people wanting to separate from the church, but maybe not as, just as puritanical, but having a different slight edge. These were Congregationalists, people that wanted to be able to make their own decisions and so forth, along the same lines that we talked about when we were talking about the English Civil War. Now, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, is eventually going to be, or initially started as a business venture. It is a charter colony with the idea and the purpose of making money. And John Winthrop, a British lawyer who was very religious, is going to be one of the founders of this, and one of the guys that gets on the board of directors. And he's going to call, much like these Puritans are going to call, for a wilderness Zion, like this outpost of their own, their own ideas and beliefs. And as it says right there with local control, what it's getting at is one of the interesting things about the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Winthrop being on the board of directors is he exploits a loophole in the charter. Most of the charters said they had to be based in London. This time, that was left out, and so the board of directors moves the home base of the company basically to the New World. So now no one really has to directly go back to check in with the home office, if you will, back in London. The direct control is right there in the town or in the community of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, in 1630, the colonists or the Puritans to go settle the Massachusetts Bay Colony leave on the Arbella. On the way, they set off with 700 people, and about 200 on the way die. As we read in class, the sort of harsh conditions to sail across the ocean and so forth, that shouldn't be too much of a surprise. Now, as they're on the ship, and we'll read this in class so we have a better understanding of it, Winthrop gives a resounding sort of pep talk in a model of Christian charity sermon. And basically he's telling the people that we have to be an example to the world. We have to be a city upon a hill, right? And if we do all these right things, we'll sort of succeed, and it'll be God's providence and so forth. Following their initial setup, this stat came from the previous book, 17 ships, 1,500 more colonists. It isn't in the current book, so I didn't look it up off the top of my head, but I imagine that was something about growing the colony. Also, but this textbook points out something different, is that this was leading off basically this mass exodus or massive movement, as your textbook calls it, the Great Migration. So 80,000 Britons begin to move from the British Isles to the Western Hemisphere, and in doing that, they populate the eastern seaboard, but they also populate places like the Caribbean, Barbados, Nevis, Montserrat, Antigua, and Jamaica, which were British Isles at that point. Now, what I want you to do is put this into context and think about it in terms of founding brothers, and who would have had, maybe in the stuff you've read so far in the first 3 chapters, who would have had, whose family would have been probably in that group. I'll ask about it in class. Now, since the charter for the company / colony was now local, the government evolves out of that company, out of that charter. And so, as your textbook describes, in 1644, the General Court, I don't know why my notes say council, the General Court is created. And basically it's going to, be, yet again, freemen, sort of like in Maryland. The General Court consisted of shareholders called freemen. At first, the freemen had no power except to choose assistants, who in turn chose the governor. In 1634, however, the freemen turned themselves into a representative body called the General Court. All right? And then eventually down the line, they segregate themselves into 2 bodies, sort of an upper house and a lower house that mimicked British Parliament and almost kind of foreshadows the eventual U.S. Congress. Now, the Massachusetts Bay Colony will have very, very stringent religious laws. All right, so you're expected to go to church. You're expected to follow certain codes and so forth. So think the Scarlet Letter, if you've had to read that. The next one we're going to talk about, Rhode Island, was born out of a different ilk. So Rhode Island will be sort of the island of misfit toys kind of idea, comparatively to the other colonies. Okay, they'll be the place that the outcasts go. Roger Williams will be basically the guy that establishes this colony. He's going to have very sort of controversial points of view when it came to religion. So the idea was, he kind of takes the Protestantism idea of salvation and fulfillment of that sort of stuff without the need of priests and stuff like that. He goes a step further and basically wonders why you need church, and that if it's if it's your own character and conscience that's the one that makes these decisions. As it says right in your chapter, in Williams' view, the purity of the church required complete separation of church and state and freedom from all coercion as a matter of faith. Forced worship, he declared, stinks in God's nostrils, meaning people should do it freely. Eventually, he's going to be expelled for these radical views. As he's expelled, technically he's banished to Britain, but him and his family slip away. And in 1636, even though it's mentioned in your textbook, he purchases land from the natives, the Narragansett Indians. And he creates his idea basically of a colony. He allowed anyone to join. He forbid anyone from bothering the Indians. And in 1652, they're going to be the first colony to outlaw slavery. Now, he also took in, different religious ideologies, from Baptists to Quakers to Jewish people. And as we'll see here, he takes in a very interesting young lady by the name of Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson was a fiery lady that had sort of encyclopedic knowledge of Scripture, and was a preacher in her home and was very outspoken. And eventually she's called before the general court and tries to plead her case, where she meets every sort of argument with Scripture that she can pull off the top of her head, and frustrates Governor Winthrop. So eventually they banish her. They banish her to Rhode Island. She goes to Rhode Island. She doesn't set in Roger Williams' town of Providence, but just a little bit south of there in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. And from there, she sort of lives her life. But the only problem was she had been pregnant at the time of her move, and she died. Her baby is born stillborn. And this is the mindset at the time, just to give you some understanding. They saw this as the people of Puritan Massachusetts saw this as God's vengeance upon her. And eventually her husband passes away in 1642, and then her and her family move to New York, where the following year her and her 6 children were massacred by an Indian attack. And as it says in your textbook, Winthrop called this a special manifestation of divine justice. So keep that in mind when you realize the points of view of these Puritan writers. Connecticut, a little more mundane than Rhode Island in its settlement. Thomas Hooker. First you can see right there it says Connecticut was settled by Massachusetts Bay colonists seeking to make their money in the fur trade. Now, also, what happens in 1636 is there is a series of churches led by Thomas Hooker who basically trek, as it calls in the old textbook, in 1636 to present-day Connecticut and establish 3 towns. Where in Connecticut they adopt the fundamental orders, which is another sort of Christian Commonwealth idea, much similar to Massachusetts Bay, except this time everyone could vote. And in the end of the day, the idea was that the governor would rule according to the Word of God. To the north of Connecticut, the land started out as one big piece, but eventually it's going to be divided into New Hampshire and Maine. So Captain John Mason and his associates take the southern part, which becomes New Hampshire, and Sir Fernando Gorges takes the northern part, which becomes Maine. Now, the interesting thing is, during the English Civil War, this area ends up being sort of administered by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and then these lawsuits have to free those 2 colonies from the grips of Massachusetts Bay. Indians in New England. By the time New England began to flourish, there were some 100,000 Indians in that area. Most of the Englishmen viewed the Native Americans as an impediment to progress. Also realized that, we were talking about this in class, the new burgeoning idea, or the idea in Europe that was coming about, or had come about, of private property and the end of feudalism and all that stuff that led up to that Civil War we talked about, was sort of the basis of their understanding, which would have been very, very different than what the Native Americans thought. They didn't have the same concept of ownership as Europeans. We often think of the Europeans as just being sort of violent towards the Indians, and that was the case, but even before that, when they were trying to live harmoniously side by side, the Europeans, remember, brought with them animals that were not indigenous to that place, and so oftentimes these animals would knock over fences or root through land that the Indians had planted, and it caused a big nuisance for the Native Americans. So they had their own beef with these encroaching Europeans. Now, the Europeans also saw these guys as an impediment, as a roadblock. And so when they tried to force them from their land, they reacted differently. Some Indians moved away, others cooperated, others fought. Some had even grown accustomed to and relied upon European goods and services and stuff like that. Now, most of these Native Americans died off in either wars against each other, because what happens is Native Americans are pushed off their land, they're going to be pushed into somebody else's land, and they were going to fight each other. They were also going to fight the Europeans, and mostly they died due to disease, smallpox, so forth. Now, as it mentions earlier, or maybe it doesn't in this chapter, I'm not sure, but the ideas of animistic beliefs, they didn't share the same belief system. As in Crash Course that you hopefully watched, talked about how they had this sort of, single creator God and then worshipped sort of natural spirits, that kind of idea. That came into stark contrast to the Christian Europeans. So, as it says right here, the English had different ways of dealing with the Indians. Sometimes they would manipulate them, meaning they would cheat them out of stuff. Sometimes they would exploit them, meaning they would get them to do their work for them. Or sometimes they just went straight out and hurt them. The Pequot War. All right, what's going to happen is Pequot Indians, a Pequot Indian is going to be accused of murdering a colonist, and the Connecticut locals take this out on them by setting fire to a Pequot village and then shooting the people as they leave. You can read their quotes in the text, but it's kind of a disturbing idea that the Lord would be pleased with people being shot and so forth. The Pequot in 1637 actually rally and attack the colonists and their Nagasat allies, the ones that were in Rhode Island. And eventually they're slaughtered by the Europeans. And at the end, they're forced to sign the Treaty of Hartford in 1638, which dissolved the Pequot Nation. And of this, Roger Williams has a commentary on it all, and it's kind of interesting. Remember, Roger Williams is the guy that established Rhode Island, and he said, as great a god with the English as gold with the Spanish, meaning land was as great a god, meaning the hunger for land is going to be just as much as the Spanish for gold, and it might be their end. Now, your textbook covers it and the notes don't, so I'm going to cover it because it's very, very important. It's possibly on your quiz. King Philip's War, all right? Following the Treaty of Hartford, 1638, it issued in a sort of uneasy peace between the natives and the Englishmen. And over time, there was some discontent and some resentment from the Indians to the to the English. And King Philip, or Metacomet of the Wampanoags tribe, he's actually going to begin to organize a war effort against the colonists. And a Christian Indian who had been sort of Anglicanized and gone to English school or gone to Harvard warns the colonists of this thing, and eventually he's murdered and found in a frozen pond. What happens is The colonial leaders convict 3 of these Wampanoag Indians as murdering him, and they hang them. This will outrage the Wampanoag, and they will attack the Puritans. And this will lead, yet again, to a counterattack from the Englishmen, and then, yet again, another counterattack from the Wampanoags, where they behead a group of Puritans. King Philip's War was very, very damaging. As your textbook points out, the percentage of people dying in it was the most per capita than any American conflict ever and since, as it puts out. It threatened major communities and urban centers like Boston, and it even made them institute the first conscription laws, which means a draft. Over time, the Wampanoag Indians and King Philip or Metacomet were not able to keep up the constant pressure that they needed to win the war. So eventually, due to disease, lack of supplies, the Indians will be defeated. And eventually, Metacomet will be hunted down and beheaded, and his head will be put on a spike and paraded through town, which will be put on a pole that will sit there for 20 years, as your textbook puts, a gruesome reminder of the British determination to control the Indians. 1640, English settlers in the northeastern Chesapeake Bay region, which equates to New Netherlands, which will be New York eventually. During this time period, we have the English Civil War, which we've covered, the whole salutary neglect thing. People start to do their own thing because the English are concerned with what's going on there. And then the restoration of Charles II. Remember I said Charles II was the fun-loving guy that didn't have a lot going on, so you had more immigration, more push for expansion, and these new colonies were out to make money. The Carolinas, all right, you basically had two major areas in the Carolinas, as you know now, north and south. The northern portion was basically populated by immigrants from Virginia, intended to be full of agriculturalists, or not planters, but like woodsman type folk. And then the southern part, the directors of the proprietary colony got planters from the Caribbean to come and populate that. If you look at how the states are shaped, South Carolina basically revolves around Charleston, while North Carolina was sort of what was left. South Carolina was governed by the Fundamental Constitution of Carolina, which was partially written by the famous English philosopher John Locke. It was kind of convoluted and difficult, but what you need to understand was that it promoted the creation of large estates/plantations. And even smaller head rights, as your textbook calls it, and land grants were given to anybody that could make it across the ocean and pay for their own voyage kind of deal. And it was also a place that had a lot of religious freedom. Early on, it made its money through slaves and cattle, and then in 1690, it began to thrive on what it's now known for, the production of rice. All right, the settling of the middle colonies. Now, the main one we're going to talk about is New York, and you can actually see up here, this is old school Manhattan. You can see what would be Broadway and what would be Wall Street, all right, all that sort of stuff. Grew out of the Dutch settlement. Now, the Dutch had thrown off the yoke of the Spanish, which we've already talked about, and they were worldwide traders. That was their big thing, international trade. New Amsterdam, or New Netherlands, or whatever you want to call it, had been established well before New England, and they were making a bustling amount of money in trade, right? In 1626, Peter Minuit purchased Manhattan Island from the Native Americans, as your textbook puts it, for roughly $1,000. And what you need to understand is the Dutch were under direct control of their government. So kind of like the Spanish and the Council of the Indies, the Dutch West India Company controlled what happened in the New World for them. And so they would have these governors, which would often be corrupt or inept or both, and they weren't well beloved, and they relied on their garrison of troops to actually keep the people safe. So the people of these places were not like tied to their governors or really to the nation itself. Realized that these Dutch colonies were very, very open. Remember, we talked about how the Dutch took in the Puritans and stuff like that. So they were a smorgasbord of international cultures. So it wasn't sort of distinctly Dutch, I guess is a good way to put it. So the Duke of York, who was Charles II's brother, James II eventually, hatches this plan of how they should do it. And basically they roll up and threaten Peter Stuyvesant, who was this one-legged governor of New Amsterdam. And he attempts to rally the people to his cause, and they won't come out, and they won't aid him. So the British basically take New Amsterdam without firing a shot. As I pointed out, the streets, a lot of the stuff we can look at and talk about is still seen today on Manhattan Island. Also, the advent of the use of Dutch words in the English language. Words like boss and crib and snoop and stoop, kill, even some other words that aren't maybe as kosher for your textbook have come from the Dutch. Also, a popular form of Christianity, Calvinism, was also prevalent in New Amsterdam. So that's also a holdover of the Dutch as well. The first group of Jewish immigrants are going to be Spanish Portuguese Jews who were fleeing the Spanish Inquisition. They are going to show up in New Amsterdam, where they are not going to be treated kindly at first. But remember, the laws in this situation are very open. And so Peter Stuyvesant tries his best to throw them out and all this sort of stuff, but the Dutch West India Company says no, can't do it. Because the Dutch West India Company is about making money. They're not here about religion and whatnot. So they settle, and as it says right here, they grew slowly. So from 1654 to 1773, they only really added 200 so people, or Jewish people at that point. Make sure to read this on your own because I'm going to cover it quickly. As I pointed out earlier, as Europeans began to gobble up land, the tribes that were on land that were Indians were being moved into often fought one another. So inter-Indian warfare intensified in the 1600s. Eventually you have the Federation of the Five Tribes and how they would deal with the fur trade. I didn't mention it in the last slide, but I should have. Remember the French and the Dutch, they were actually pretty friendly with the Indians to some point, trying to be business partners. And what would happen is oftentimes these business partners would lead to Indians fighting one another for the monopoly rights, basically. The Iroquois are going to begin to play off European powers against one another. That's really the long and the short of it. Trying to make money for themselves by trying to monopolize the fur trade. You can see down here in the picture, you have the Iroquois national lacrosse team, which is actually pretty interesting. In the world of lacrosse, you have national teams like in soccer or basketball or whatever, but the Iroquois, being Native American, actually formed their own team that gets to compete. So I've always found that to be pretty cool. The Duke of York is basically going to make political alliances here by beseeching some of his land to Sir George Carteret and Lord John Berkeley, named after the Isle of... basically, he gives them New Jersey, west and east, named after the Isle of Jersey, which is in the English Channel. The east part of Jersey ends up being the Dutch and Puritans and the Scots, while the west part of Jersey ends up being Swedes, Finns, and English Quakers. In 1702, eventually they form one royal colony. They don't have as interesting a story, but the population there does lead to some pretty neat advancements in society we'll see down the road. George Fox is going to found the Quakers, yet again during that English Civil War period. And the Quakers were renowned for being pacifists. That was their big thing. William Penn will be a Oxford-educated guy who, once his father dies, he inherits a ton of land. He's forced to name it his father's name after his father, Pennsylvania, meaning Penn's Woods. And he travels there to basically set up Pennsylvania, at which time eventually he sets it up and he leaves. He doesn't live in Pennsylvania for a long time. That's one of those interesting little facts. Also, not the guy on the Quaker Oat can. Just throwing that out there for you too. He established his colony in 1681, yet again the concepts of religious freedom. And his famous quote here, "Any government is free where the laws rule and the people are party to the laws," meaning we're all equal in this. He was known for his relationship between the Indians. They were often cordial. He didn't take land from them. He often purchased it. And they attempted to live peacefully side by side. Even though this is the case, there are some things where at times Quaker settlements had to actually fight Native Americans, and so they had to come up with a way to do this and hire people and hide basically their purchase of arms by claiming they were supplies and stuff like that. It's actually kind of an interesting little deal. Also, the Duke of York gave Penn Delaware as well, and eventually Pennsylvania and Delaware had to share the same governor until after the Revolution. Quickly here through Georgia, last of the British colonies established, George II at the time as the king in 1732, intended to be a philanthropic experiment and a military buffer with Spain. So the idea was, we're going to roll the dice with this area from between Florida and South Carolina, and philanthropic, it was supposed to be a penal colony. It was going to be a place to rehabilitate people. So when they started, General James Oglethorpe is going to come up with the idea of having very strict laws. All right, 1732, 100 colonists found the city of Savannah. They want to grow grapes to make wine, or mulberry bushes for silk, for silkworms to spin silk on. Both of these fail. Eventually, tobacco and other stuff will happen. Grants limited in size to 500 acres. Rum and the importation of slaves were prohibited. But the problem is these are mostly criminals, and they don't have enough people to sort of keep everyone in line, so eventually these rules collapse. In 1754, it will no longer be a proprietary colony, and it will revert back to the crown, where all the rules go out the window. Rice, indigo, lumber, beef, and pork are going to be the main things that they trade, and their main trading partner will be the West Indies, or the Caribbean, not all the way back to England. Now, the interesting thing is, Georgia was probably the least popular place you would want to go. You were going to die there of malaria before the age of 30, and it was way too hard to sort of scratch out a living. This slide is sort of self-explanatory, but as it says right here, after a late start, the English dominated the New World ahead of the Spanish and the French. So the Spanish had this massive head start. When the English come to the game, they began very quickly to colonize and establish urban centers, where Spain took a long time to do that. The lack of a plan gave the English colonists more freedom to be successful. Remember, they weren't under direct control of their government at all times, so they kind of did what they had to do to become successful. While Spain had like a mercantile policy that said you had to trade with us, well, even England had that, but basically they tried to control everything, and they couldn't plan for everything, so it was too rigid to be flexible enough to figure out what they had to do. English colonies were also not as far-reaching as others, more dense and located by the coast. So you can see that as well. Most of the major cities are along the coast. One of the two major early Spanish cities, besides, say, well, even Mexico City, Santa Fe, those places aren't in the coast. So it was more difficult to do that. All right, this is chapter 2, guys. Sorry I had to speed it up at the end, but I had to get it done.